While we're just waiting to get started here, and I just want to do some, I guess, brief background info. So thankfully Wes introduced me, Pastor Eli Shaw. I've been a pastor about 5 years now, serving just shy of 4 years at Peace in Cincinnati. I know God has a sense of humor because when I was getting my first call, I'm like, please be in Ohio, please be in Ohio, please be in Ohio. And then I hear my name, my first name's Paul, so I hear Paul Shaw, pastor, Peace Lutheran Church, Cincinnati, Ohio, and I'm like, okay, where's that? So that congregation was just not on my radar, and then so I pull it up on a map after the call my identity is finished, and I have to chuckle because I'm like, oh yeah, it's in the southwest corner of the state. Like I'm just barely in Ohio. I'm okay, oh my God, you answered my prayer. I'm in Ohio. You answer with a yes, but it's just barely, right on the edge there in the tri-state area. So served just about 4 years there, and I've been serving at Bethany, my second call, about a year now. One of the reasons, the congregation in Cincinnati was wonderful. The area was great, the people were great, the congregation was just awesome. It was largely a matter of like family, just being closer to my family. My family has deep roots in the Hocking Hills. My family originally settled in the Hocking Hills in the 1820s. So just being closer to my home and my family and my roots was a lot of it. So now we're really close now, being serving in Columbus, living in Canal Winchester now. So yeah, it's been great. Been very blessed at Bethany for the year that I've been serving there. They've been wonderful, and I have to say that because there's a handful of Bethany members here. So I have to say they're great. Because they're sitting right in this room. Yeah. No, you guys really have been wonderful. All right, so we'll go ahead and get into the topic. And the title, if you guys have your handout, is Talking About Closed Communion. I realized after I picked my topic and I started to kind of see, okay, what were some of the other topics at previous owls? And it seems like Wes said, almost every year, I guess, there's a closed communion conversation or topic. So then I was like, well, oops, because it seems like we've already talked about this. And in fact, just as I was downstairs right before this, okay, they're not in here, are they? Okay, because I can pick on some people. Okay, they're not in here, great. I don't know who they are, so that's also, maybe I can leave it anonymous. But in fact, before I even put my name tag on, they were like talking about like my topic and my presentation. They're like, oh, it's just, it is what it is, right? Closed communion, it is what it is. And on the one hand, yeah, it is what it is. Quite literally, when we talk about communion, right, it's the body and blood of Christ. It is what it is. It is what Christ says. But I kind of want to push back on that. Like, is it really what it is? And not so much the Lord's Supper itself, obviously, because it is what it is. Christ said, this is my body, this is my blood. But talking about it with visitors, with family members, with people who have no knowledge of the Christian faith, it really isn't what it is. And what I mean by that is how we go about talking about and confessing our communion practice, what we believe about the Lord's Supper, closed communion, just to use the name of the topic. It kind of isn't what it is. And what I mean by that is it can be done well when we're talking with visitors, with family, friends. We can do it well. We can communicate what we believe in our communion practice as well, or we can communicate them very poorly. I've seen both in my little experience. I still consider myself a baby pastor, 5 years roughly, but in my experience, I've seen the topic of closed communion handled very well with visitors and with new members of congregations. I've seen it handled very poorly. And so that's why I wanted to talk about this topic, not so much like, okay, what is closed communion or defending it, not the apologetics per se, but more about how do we communicate and share our confession, our beliefs, our doctrine, our communion practices. How do we share those with other people and equipping not just pastors, but lay people, leadership in congregations, elders, ushers, greeters, whomever, to be able to talk about our communion practices clearly and effectively with again, visitors, family members, those who may not understand or know what closed communion is and why we practice it. So that's really the gist of this, is not talking about closed communion per se, but talking about closed communion with other people, especially those who are not familiar with LCMS, our congregations, our communion practice, because you get visitors, right? You get people. I'll share some stories, and I'll ask you guys for your input as well, because this isn't just going to be me talking. I'm hoping to be very conversational, at least at a certain point. I'll start with some introductory kind of things, just defining things, just for the sake of unity, so we all know what we're talking about, clarity. So we'll define what closed communion is, and of course we can even debate that. This is just a very general thing. We'll talk a little bit about closed communion in the scriptures and so forth, and a lot more could be said, but that's not necessarily the point. The point is more about how we talk about closed communion with other people. And so that's where I want your guys' input, your experience, your reflections, questions. So I want this to be very conversational. It's kind of how I do Bible study too. I'm not just up there talking the whole time. I would wear myself out. I get chronic migraines, and so the more I talk, the worse my headaches get, so I just can't do that very long. So I do that's another reason I like to hear from you. Give me a little break. So that's how we're going to go about this. All right, so just kind of getting started then, we will go through the handout. We'll get to the point where I'm going to ask from you guys, but we'll get there. So just for our purposes, what is closed communion? Looking at the top of page 1 on the handout. One definition I found, and again, we could debate this to some extent, but we'll just say closed communion. We'll go with this definition here. The practice of refusing communion to certain Christians and the general population at Lutheran altars is called close communion. Now notice the footnote there, close. It could be close, closed, or close, parenthesis, D, other parenthesis, right? It's like, which is it of these three phrases? We're just going to, for the sake of our purposes, close and closed communion are the same thing. We're not going to get into all that right now. It's not the point. All right. Closed communion or closed communion. So it's worth asking, okay, so again, with closed communion, not everyone can receive communion with us. It's like you ask the question like this, is the Lord's Supper for everyone? In a sense, yes, okay, but really, properly speaking, or more strictly speaking, no, the Lord's Supper is not for everyone, at least not right now. Not everyone is a disciple, right? Jesus gave the Lord's Supper to his disciples. How did he say to make disciples? Baptizing and teaching, right? Not everyone, fits that description of a disciple, therefore they're not necessarily fit for the Lord's Supper, at least not right now, not yet. So not everyone receives it. So who is to be admitted to the Lord's Supper and who is not? That's what this next part gets into. So in our churches, again, you can see the footnotes for where I'm pulling these things from. But just for the sake of our time, I'll just get right into it. In our churches and others, only those persons who have been properly instructed in the meaning, use, and benefit of the sacrament may receive the sacrament. Practically speaking, this means that Holy Communion is offered only to those persons who are confirmed members in good standing of LCMS congregations and those church bodies in full pulpit and altar fellowship with us. It should be noted also that communion is not to be given to the unrepentant nor unbelievers. I could say a lot more about this as far as practically speaking, because it kind of makes you wonder. Unfortunately, not even everybody, say in the LCMS, believes what we as LCMS Christians believe, right? That it's the body and blood of Christ. Not to get too off into the weeds, but in my last congregation in a Bible study, we were talking about the Lord's Supper, and it actually seemed like he had a symbolic view of it. And I'm like, wait a minute, what? He was like saying, well, it just symbolizes or represents the body and blood of Christ. And I'm like, hold on, wait a minute. Like, this is in an LCMS church in our Bible study. Wait a minute. So unfortunately, just because we're members of the LCMS and we're confirmed and in good standing doesn't even necessarily mean that we are to be admitted to the Lord's Supper. It should be a a guarantee based on what we believe and teach and stuff, but unfortunately, practically speaking, it's actually not always the case. So, food for thought. All right. Quickly getting into the scriptural basis for closed communion. A lot more could be said. Other scriptures could be mustered, but I'm just pulling out two right now for our purposes. And the first is, hopefully these are well known also, by the way, not just among pastors, but lay people. The first is 1 Corinthians 11, verses 27 through 32. St. Paul writes, "Whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and blood of the Lord. Let a person examine himself then, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. That is why many of you are weak and ill, and some have died. But if we judged ourselves truly, we would not be judged. But when we are judged by the Lord, we are disciplined, so that we may not be condemned along with the world." The second, I'll share a few brief comments on these, but just if we flip the page, we'll go to the second reference here, again, 1 Corinthians, now chapter 10, verses 16 through 17. St. Paul writes, "The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation, a communion in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ?" Again, a communion. "Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread." Okay, here's some just brief comments. I know much more could be said, but for the sake of our time, just a few brief comments from the scriptures that I've summarized below. Just continuing on here. "The Lord's Supper is Christ's gift and blessing, whereby he gives us his body and blood for the forgiveness of sins. But the Lord's Supper can be received one of two ways. It can either be received to our benefit or to our harm." And again, that's on the basis of the first passage, 1 Corinthians 11. "None of us wants a person to receive the sacrament to his or her harm." At least I would think so. It's a fifth commandment issue, right? Harming our neighbor in his body and protecting our neighbor, right? Which is one reason why our churches practice closed communion, right? We don't want anyone to receive the Lord's Supper to their harm. There's a distinction to be made here between baptism and the Lord's Supper. Baptism can only be received to our benefit, right? There's no, other side of the coin per se, where baptism it's simply given as a blessing, right? But with the Lord's Supper, in a sense it's different because it's like a two-sided coin. We can either receive it to our benefit or we can receive it to our harm. Baptism's not that way. We can't somehow receive baptism to our harm, right? But the Lord's Supper is not like that. So that's why we have to be careful on whom we give the Lord's Supper to, who is to be admitted to the Lord's table, so that they don't receive the sacrament to their harm. Okay. Moving on, 1 Corinthians 10 indicates that the Lord's Supper is a confession of our shared faith. I think this is one that we don't always know or understand very well, because when people come to our churches, they're like, "Why can't I have communion with you? Who are you to tell me, right, what I can and can't do?" That's one of the misconceptions. And it's because we don't understand that the Lord's Supper is a confession of our shared faith. It's not just like we welcome anyone and everyone up to the altar with us to receive the Lord's Supper. Again, continuing, it requires unity in doctrine and practice among those who receive it. So I think we need to know that. As Reverend McCain puts it, there's the footnote 6 if you want to see more on that. He puts it like this: "The celebration of Holy Communion is also a public act of confession." I don't think we always see that or acknowledge that or even know that. Hopefully we do. In other words, it testifies to our unity in the teaching of the apostles. When you receive the sacrament at a church's altar, you are giving public testimony that you agree with that church's doctrinal position. I think that's little known. And that's in fact what is going on, but I don't think, of course, those outside of our churches, right, they probably don't know that. Even, our members, right, in the LCMS may not realize that. So I think that's important. This is why we believe, teach, and confess that Holy Communion is the highest expression of church fellowship. That's important. Okay, thus, closed communion intends to preserve the unity of faith believed and confessed by those who receive the sacrament. Okay, so there's these two parts to it. There's the fact that we can receive the Lord's Supper to our benefit or to our harm, and then there's the fact that the Lord's Supper is a confession of our faith, our unity of the faith by those who are communing at that altar. Both of those are important. Both of those we need to know when talking about closed communion with other people. All right, here's where I want your input. Here's where I want you guys to chime in as much as you like. Again, we do have limited time, but I do want to hear from you. So, when talking about closed communion, I've got a handful of questions just for our discussion, for engagement, reflection. And first one's this: what misconceptions do people have about the practice of closed communion? What comes to mind? How do people misunderstand it or not understand it?
This is between me and God.
Right.
You don't have any right to
Yeah.
close communion off to.
Exactly. Yeah. Like it's just some individual, me and God kind of thing. It's just, well, I'm communing with God. That's all that matters, or that's the important thing. So who are you to tell me what I can and can't do? I'm right with the Lord, right? I can receive, the Lord's Supper. Who are you to tell me that I can't? That's important and a good point. I think it's a common misconception, maybe not among members in our, churches, right? But other Protestant, church bodies, that's kind of the idea. It's just me and Jesus, right? Kind of this individualistic American, Christianity that's very, again, individualistic, me-centered. It's just me and Jesus. So, yeah, who are you to tell me what I can and can't do?
They don't recognize that they are sharing that confession with the other congregation that they're communing with if they participate in that.
Right, yeah. That's either not known or it's just very little emphasized, because again, the idea is, well, it's just me and Jesus, so yeah, so I can do what I want. Other thoughts? Yeah.
I think too, sometimes a person that is told, please not to receive the sacrament, will look at it as like, oh, they're kind of like a country club, they're exclusive.
Yeah.
But that's the type of person you need to explain to them that this is for your benefit, not for our benefit, so
Yeah.
that's.
Yeah, absolutely. That was one of the thoughts I had as I was thinking about these questions, is precisely that it's like they view, closed communion or those who practice it as like country club Christians. It's just, we are allowed to have this and you guys aren't. It's like us against them kind of mentality. Like, well, they can have it together. They can have the Lord's Supper, but I can't. Again, who are you to tell me what I can and can't do? You guys are like speaking about, us in closed communion. It's like people will say, well, you're judgmental. You're, fill in the blank, and so exclusive, that kind of thing. Yeah, and so that's obviously a misconception. It's not like we're having a Lord's Supper together because we're better than other people, or we think we're better than other people. It's because we know that these people are, trained, instructed, they're baptized, and confirmation is not necessarily a check mark for the Lord's Supper. It's more like, this is the instruction that's just how we do it in our churches, how we instruct people to receive the Lord's Supper. It's like pre-communion catechesis, I guess, to put it that way. And so it's not like we're just like excluding ourselves. We know that these people are properly instructed. They can examine themselves. They know what they're receiving and why they need it. Not that we're like better than other people or something. Yeah.
Especially when it comes to people from especially like from the Reformed background or even evangelicalism, there's a huge misconception of even what the Lord's Supper is. And that's a huge step to get past, is just understanding what it is, because they don't get the idea that it's for their harm. It's like, no, this is communion. It's not for my harm, because there's nothing, it's just
it's just symbolic.
Remembering.
Yeah, it's just a memorial meal.
And as a pastor, people come in 5 minutes before the service starts. You don't have time to even get into this kind of discussion. And people, and I can tell if people are gonna come back to the service the next Sunday just by their reaction to the communion thing. But and there's even a gospel reductionism there. You believe in Jesus, I believe in Jesus. What's the big deal?
Right. yeah, we believe the same things, right? I
Yeah.
believe in Jesus, He's my Savior, He died for my sins, you know, He forgives me, and yeah. And so we can have communion together, and it's just a memorial meal anyway, so like who cares, right? There's no harm there, no benefit, it's just a symbolic, right? That's not what we believe, and so that's a huge barrier. And that 5-minute like time block that you get to talk with people, that's something that's that's something I wanna talk about too, is because, you know, I have that issue, right? We get it, people come before the service and you don't really have the time to talk with people, so how do we handle that? But yeah, in the back there.
Yeah, one of the misconceptions I deal with as a pastor is, well, I'm from the ELCA, we're both Lutherans.
Right, yeah, oh yeah, we're Lutheran, yeah, maybe not. But this is, oh boy, this is gonna be on the internet, so, oops. Yeah, right, yeah, same kind of thing.
Kind of piggybacking off the exclusionary part, that it is supposed to limit it to only people who have an academic understanding, a certain level of that. And I've also heard that it's a holdover from Catholic, something that wasn't discarded from the Reformation.
Oh, sure, that's interesting, yeah, and something that's worth thinking about, maybe as an aside, is that, you know, closed communion is not just a Lutheran practice. It's not just a, you know, Lutheran, to back on that comment, it's not, you know, it's a Catholic, and by Catholic, I mean, you know, kata holos, according to the universal church. That's been the practice from the beginning, was closed communion. It's only, this open communion thing is only a new innovation, you know, within the last, like 200-300 years or something like that, who knows, but when that started. But that's not been the church's historic practice, is open communion. And, oh goodness, but yeah, other misconceptions there too. Oh, yeah.
Well, I think first off, the word closed is a very negative word, and I wish it was never used. I mean, closed
Sure.
sounds a little better. Closed
Sounds
immediately
exclusive,
makes people
isolating,
feel like
yeah,
I'm left out.
yeah. Holier than
And,
thou.
right, and I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
part of it is not understanding communion.
Mhm.
So a visitor, especially visitors who come in, and you can simplify it all the way down to the fact that a visitor is left in the pew while others all go up front and they're sitting there, they feel, I mean, that's a simplification of it, but you know, that they don't get to go up and and so people are looking
Yeah,
at them,
right.
why aren't they? I mean, and there's
Awkward,
so many little nuances about that.
Yeah,
But I think information about what it is
yeah.
and that it's a loving Christian way to not let you take it is
Yeah.
really, it's hard to convene to people if they come in late or a visitor. Yeah, it is.
Right.
My husband struggles with that,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, that's probably why I've seen some of these like bad examples of talking about it with people, because you only have so much time, maybe even a minute, 5 minutes to talk about it, so it's not like you can get into everything.
I mean, we have a great congregation though. They, especially with visitors, I feel like we just, it's not even just like, you know, my husband doesn't have to, there's elders and the lady in the next pew and they're all talking with them and they
That's
they
good.
talk to them about communion
Good, yeah.
and so,
And that's part of
They
the
do a
purpose
good
of
job
this, is
at
so
our-
that,
at
yeah,
our
people
church.
can talk about it,
Yeah.
besides just the pastor, because there's generally one pastor and lots of, people coming through the doors,
Yeah.
maybe not lots of visitors, but
Yeah.
still, you can't talk to everybody. You got 5 minutes, as the pastor, right? So it's good that other people know how to
right.
communicate this, well. I definitely could, man, I have to take yours because you're from Bethany. Sorry, then we'll move on. That's like, if I don't take hers, then I'm in trouble. Yeah.
I thought that I had heard many years ago that the older church, the original church, or
Mhm,
they dismissed the congregation
mhm.
or the visitors and then had
Yeah,
communion.
close the doors, yeah, right, yeah, which again sounds very exclusive, yeah, but it's like,
Sorry.
I wish I could get more into that. I mean, that is my understanding, is that's what they did, and yeah, I don't have the time we'll have to talk about that at Bethany, but I don't have 18 more minutes, so, but yeah, that's a good point, though. I wish I could get into that more. Okay, last one,
Just
sorry,
a
no.
couple comments.
Yeah.
One practice that I've seen done at one church I filled in on down in West Virginia that would record their services, they would actually stop the recording
when communion was taking
Oh,
place.
yeah.
So I was, given instruction, the way the practice was to have like a short benediction at that point in the service. Then they would stop the recording and then we would continue with communion. Another, just a thing that I've kind of fallen into is not to be exclusive with families, especially when you have families with visitors, extended family, and not to make people feel left out, is to invite them up to the communion rail, not to give them communion, but to give them a blessing. And then they're still feeling like they're part of the family. If we are Christians and we are part, but we still need to train the rest of the ones, and not to practice open communion, but to still
Yeah,
have more of an inclusive kind of an atmosphere.
sure.
Just some thoughts.
Thanks. For the sake of time, we'll just move on. I could keep you guys here all day, and we could talk about this again, all day. That's the unfortunate thing about having only like so much time. Second question on page 2, right? Have you ever talked with somebody? I mean, obviously the pastors have, others of you, I'm sure you have. So when you guys have talked about, close communion, whether it be, as a pastor before the service, if you're talking to, relative, friend, family, whatever, how do you go about that conversation? Was it awkward? Was it uncomfortable? No. Yeah.
Quite often I will refer back to what Paul McCain said, and I'll say, look, I'm not in the business of making liars. You don't believe because you're from a different church, you don't have the same beliefs we have. So if you take communion with mine, then I don't want to do that too.
Yeah.
And usually that goes pretty good.
Yeah. Okay. Other, reflections?
I was talking to some coworkers one time, and they said that they had gone to a Missouri Synod church and they wouldn't go and take communion, and they said, we think that's stupid. And I said, well, if you think it's stupid, if you don't believe what they believe, why would you want to take communion? They had no answer for that.
Sure, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, inviting them up for a blessing, I do that. I think it's a good thing, because that way they're not left in the pew by themselves. And the other thing I do is I just usually say, I don't know what your faith and what your beliefs are. And I said, I'm more than happy to sit down and see where you're at, and we can talk about communion. And then I tell them, you can come up, I'll give you a blessing. And I have in the bulletin, I take full responsibility as the pastor. If you haven't talked to me, you won't be communed. And I don't want to put it on, yes, my elders do talk to them and they'll come up and let me know.
Sure.
And I will encourage all pastors and even everybody that's here, if you're going to be going somewhere else to church as a visitor, and it's an LCMS church, make a point to talk to the pastor and say, hey, I'm a visitor, I'm a member of this church in good standing, I would like to take communion, and that pastor will be forever in debt to you, because you just made his life real easy.
Yeah, I had that actually, I forget if it was last Sunday or the one before, that visitor Paul from Washington or whatnot. But anyway, yeah, he was a member of an LCMS church, and he said, I'm a member of this church, I'm in good standing, I'm here on business,
Yeah.
I'd like to have the Lord's Supper with you. And I was like, great.
That's wonderful.
I said, welcome aboard, right?
One thing to piggyback on that too is I've even before when I'm going to know I'm going to a certain church, I've even emailed the church
Yeah.
a week ahead
Yeah.
saying,
I've
I'm
had
planning
people
to
do
be
that.
here.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Give them background. Zion Lutheran Church Columbus, even the pastor name, so
Mhm.
it's helpful, I'm sure, for others.
Yes, it is.
Being on the receiving end of some of these conversations, I think one of the reasons that talking about this is a testimony of what you believe works really well is because it doesn't depend on them believing what we believe about communion. If you say it's because it's the body and blood of Christ, they don't actually believe that. They don't want to act in accordance with that, but they do want to act in accordance, even if they believe it's just a memorial. If you're saying, well, the remembrance that you're showing is that you believe these other things to the rest of the congregation, then they would be like, oh, well, I don't want to say I'm something that I'm not.
Sure, yeah. That's interesting. I like hearing that because, I mean, that's one direction I haven't thought of too much, honestly, is like, well, we believe different things. I wasn't even sure that people would actually take well to that, honestly, like, well, who cares? Yeah, but yeah, sometimes, I mean, people take well to that. Sure. Others, yeah.
Yeah, so what do you do when you have a child that you know he believes the way that you do, but because his wife doesn't, and he leaves the Lutheran church, or maybe he goes to the Presbyterian church, but as you're talking with him, you know that he still has those beliefs firm in his heart.
Yeah. The child, you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. That's a great question. With not, I mean, I don't necessarily have a specific answer because, I mean, circumstances, like, for me, it's, again, I don't know the situation. I can go down, rabbit holes and hypotheticals and, circumstances kind of bear out how you handle that. So, I hate to not answer your, answering it by not answering it. We could talk, how about we talk about it more afterwards, if that's okay, just because for the sake of time, and I do have some thoughts to share, but just for the sake of time. And my, like, imprecision and how I like to ramble, we'll save it for after, is that all right? Is that okay, a couple minutes, sure, okay. I tend to ramble, so I could be rambling all day on that, sorry.
So if someone comes up and doesn't understand this, the doctrine, the LCMS doctrine, so on the sacrament, they eat and drink judgment on themselves. So that's why we want to keep from harming them. But
Yeah.
if they, how does that affect the rest of the community? Because we say we have a unity in confession, and that doesn't compromise that. I mean, let's say you have 20% of the people up there just don't really understand. How does that compromise communion? And why, why are we trying to protect it?
When you say compromise communion, do you mean like compromise the unity of faith and confession, or compromise that it's the body and blood of Christ? I would say
Right,
probably
well,
the former, but.
Yeah, well, I'm just asking why would we concern ourselves with that? If there are 2 or 3 people coming up there that you feel like they don't really understand it, should we try to stop them?
Well, yeah, good question. On the one hand, I mean, Paul puts it like this, that, we pastors are stewards of the mysteries of God, right? Mysteries being the sacraments. I mean, you could think about it narrowly, that's what sacrament means, it's mystery. And so, on the one hand, it's the pastor's job, I come from a background of like shepherds and sheep, right? So this analogy works well for me. But it's like when you're up at the Lord's table, you're like the shepherd guarding the communion rail. Like, so you're like guarding the pasture, who gets, like, which sheep go in, which go out. And so it is so that helps me when it comes to stewarding the mysteries, because, I mean, coming from a shepherding background, that just helps. But it's like you're the shepherd who's guarding the pen or the gate. Let's see who goes in, who goes out. And in the case of, now applying it to pastors and the Lord's Supper, it's you're in charge of and responsible for who receives it and who doesn't. It's on your head.
And it's on the
yeah.
congregation's head too.
Sure,
Because
yeah.
the pastor practices the work that God has given to the church. And, it's like, well, if people come up, it's on them if they come up and they receive it to their harm.
Sure.
Yeah, but it's also on us, because do we want to cause somebody to blaspheme and sin against the body and blood of Christ? My answer as a pastor is absolutely no, I don't want to contribute to that.
Sure.
Because then I've led them into sin. That's not my job as a pastor, nor is that what we do as Christians.
Yeah.
And so that's why we are concerned with closed communion. We want to protect them from sinning against the body and blood of Christ.
Yeah, and that's back to misconceptions, where one of the misconceptions is that, closed communion is an unloving practice. Well, why? Because, you're excluded, right? It's for us and not for you, and so they see closed communion as unloving, because, if you were loving, you would let me, have the Lord's Supper with you, but you're, showing me you don't love me by saying, no, you can't have this, at least not right now. But closed communion is actually a loving practice, and I think communicating it that way can help people to understand, oh, I see why they're not letting me have communion with them, because it is for my protection, for my benefit, as, you know, speaking from kind of the mind of the visitor. It is a loving practice, closed communion, because we are trying to keep people from receiving it to their harm, right? We want people to receive it to their benefit and not to their harm. And so it is important that we, especially as pastors who are stewards of the mysteries and whom God says he will judge with greater strictness, right, that we shepherd in that way, like, you know, who receives it, who doesn't, which sheep in a sense go in and which go out.
Even as parents, we restrict our kids from
Yeah.
doing things because we don't want
It's
them
a
to harm
loving
themselves.
No, right? No,
Why
of
do
course
we
not.
yank them out of the street? Because we don't want them to
Right.
get hit by a car and die.
Mhm. Yeah.
And, you know, is that a loving thing as a parent for your child? I
Right,
sure
yeah.
think it is.
What was unloving? You pulled my arm. No, it saved your life, right? Yeah, right. And those kind of analogies can help too. I mean, I've thought about it that way and it's even explained it that way.
Well, I think as Christians, we are judged. If we do as closed communion, you're unloving, you're judgmental,
Right,
right? As a
yeah.
Christian, we get all of that raining
Yeah.
down on us.
Right.
But there are so many rules we have. You have to pass a test, you have to learn how to drive before you get a license. I mean, there's so many things that you need knowledge before you get to do.
Yeah,
And I
it
don't,
seems like that's
and
lost
so,
on
right,
some
but it's
right
because
now.
as a Christian, we are looked at like, you need to be all loving and open and,
Right.
you know, how
Well,
can
means
you
letting
be
me do
restrictive in
whatever I
any
want.
way?
Yeah,
They don't see it as the loving.
yeah,
way.
that's just misunderstanding
Yeah.
what love is, which is a whole nother issue, but yeah, it's
Well, the quick word, as a pastor, at an LCMS church, the first thing I think you need to look at is a person that's a member and going through everything is the first outwardly sign that they can accept it. Inwardly, whatever is in their heart is not up to the pastor. We pray that. So a person wants to be part of a member, do that. Being a member and being an LCMS member, Luther member, is the first sign that you believe and believe what we want. Just like anything, you can't get a pension from a teachers union if you're an iron worker. The rule of life is really pretty simple. That's the problem from a pastor standpoint. I think that's the simplest thing to do is basically, if you really wanted to believe what we believe, you would be in that. And life is hard and cruel, and our job isn't necessary to make it easy for them to be that way. Christ died just because we can't do anything. So, I mean, having a person be questioned about whether they can take communion or not, I think is very simple, as a simple, problem. So. But thanks for being a pastor. So.
We'll do one more, and then I'll just share a couple stories and how I've maybe gone through this, talking about closed communion with people, what went well, maybe what didn't go so well. A couple of examples of like kind of stereotypes or generalizations of things, kind of explaining or talking about closed communion gone wrong, bad examples. And since we're short on time, we won't get into this whole thing about communion statements and bulletin inserts, but just take a look at that. And that's a helpful thing, to just have a clear communion statement and like bulletin inserts. Even sometimes like a verbal announcement might even be might need to be made depending on the circumstances. But we won't be able to get into all that. This is why our Bible studies take so long. Like, it took me 2 years to get through Genesis in the first congregation. I knew I was going to have more than we were able to do. That's all right. But, so one more was
if you're in an isolated area, let's say you don't have an LCMS church anywhere nearby, so would you advise people, no, you can't take communion? But there are other non-denominational, because I know my mom was in that situation. She goes, you hear the consecration of the elements, everything seems the same. I know what I believe is that taking communion to my harm, even though the people around me actually have a different confession.
Well, it really depends on the congregation and everything, because you may not even be receiving communion. It may not even be a valid sacrament depending on where you are. I mean, if they've got goldfish crackers and Diet Pepsi up there, right? Like, is that the sacrament? No. And it's like, well, I believe it's the body and blood of Christ, but like objectively, it's not. So, it kind of depends on the congregation. And I mean, if you really want to know what's being served and what's, like, if it's the sacrament or not, like, who are you gonna talk to? Talk to the pastor. Like, what are you having here? If the pastor says, well, we're having communion, you ask them, like, okay, what is it? Like, what are you actually having? Well, and then they get into it. Maybe if you're in the LCMS congregation, you'll get an answer like, well, we're having the body and blood, you know, it's like, you know, it is the body and blood of Christ in with and under the bread and wine, that kind of thing. But if you go to, like, say, you know, a mega church or who knows what, or many, you know, Protestant church bodies, if you go to one of their churches, it might just be like, I don't know, a memorial meal. They might even specify it. It's just like a remembrance of, you know, what Jesus did. Or if, you know, you get into you see the goldfish crackers and the Diet Pepsi, then you're like, okay, danger, you know, I'm not going to commune with them because it's not actually the Lord's Supper. It's just, I don't know, so I just call it silly, but there's other words for it.
I would have your mom or you contact a Missouri Synod pastor that's somewhere near, even if it's an hour away.
Yeah. LCMS,
And I would
church locator or
talk
whatnot.
to that pastor and see if he would be willing to come out to her at her home and commune her.
Yeah.
Because quite honestly, as a pastor, I would be willing to do that.
Better that than go where there's
Exactly.
goldfish crackers and Diet
Because
Pepsi,
if
who knows?
if you go to somewhere else, are you potentially at some point gonna have doubt, am I really receiving
Yeah.
the
that's a
body and
problem.
blood of Christ? Because that's a huge issue. If you, doubting it is a problem. And so, yeah, I would say if you know where there's an LCMS church, see if the pastor or a pastor somewhere is willing to come out and actually commune, or kind of like a shut-in on a monthly basis. Because then you can be sure of what you're receiving, and you can be sure of the benefit of what you're receiving.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, absolutely. Real quick, I know we're about at 10. I just want to share a couple of quick examples. Hopefully I'll go quickly as far as this goes, because I know we're about at time. Examples and stories, just skipping down on page 3 there. The first one's Jeff, good old Jeff. So this was my last congregation. Jeff was new to the Christian faith, like he really didn't know much of anything. He was just kind of new, very like, you know, not religious or whatnot at the time. And this gentleman's in his 60s. He's like coming to our church. He's a visitor. He visits the first time. He comes back the next week. The first week we didn't have communion. The second week we do. That he comes, it happened to be the first and third Sundays when we had communion at my last congregation. And so I didn't think to give him a heads up about communion, because the first service he came to was not a communion service. And then he came for a communion service. He goes up to the rail, right? And because I didn't, I was like, oh, whoops, I didn't see baby pastor, I dropped the ball there. But he goes up to the communion rail. And when I'm up there at the rail with him, I just said, like, let's talk about this afterwards. You know, we'll talk afterwards. And so we did. So he was up at the rail. I just simply said, as I was, you know, making my way down it, I kind of got close and I said, you know, we'll talk later. And he was cool with that. We talked after the service. I told him, or I kind of explained our communion practice, and how I didn't want him to receive it. The body and blood of Christ was harm. You know, I was talking about, you know, explaining the loving, you know, character behind closed communion, and he totally understood that. He's like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. You know, this is the body and blood of Christ. You could receive it to your harm. You could receive it to your benefit, or your benefit. And I don't want you to receive it to your harm. And so that's why I said, let's talk later. He was cool with that. Second example is somewhat similar. It's a younger gentleman, but Matt and his fiance at the time, she was a member of Peace. He was not. A Roman Catholic background for this gentleman, but again, it was one of those things. I was doing adult new member class with them. I was doing premarital counseling with them, and so that was time to kind of get into more detail about, you know, our communion practice and such. And again, I explained it that way, is that, you know, you can receive it to your benefit or to your harm, and we want you to receive the sacrament to your benefit. He's like, oh yeah, makes perfect sense. So kind of dispelling the misconception of closed communion being an unloving practice, showing that it is a loving practice, right? I don't want you to receive this to your harm. That seems to, at least in those cases, that seems to have really helped.
Pastor Shaw, I'm sorry to cut you off, but
That's okay.
10
Well,
o'clock,
yeah.
so we can
Oh,
get people
yeah.
to the next session.
That's right, oh, that's right, yes. Anyway, a couple bad examples, you'll see them, they're like, are you Lutheran? And people feel, of course, scandalized, right, like, are you Lutheran? Like, that's the one was one, and the other was, you know, I heard an example of a pastor say, you can't have communion with us, it's like, oh dear, that's, okay, maybe that's not the best way to do it. So how we communicate, how we talk to people matters. Thank you for being with me this morning, the Lord be with you.